So now that we learned about useReducer, let me again sum up when you should use useState and when it might be an idea to use useReducer. Now, generally, you will know when you need useReducer. That might not be the greatest rule of all times, but you will see when you need useReducer, for example, because using useState becomes too cumbersome, you find yourself dealing with a lot of kind of related state snapshots which still are kind of independent, and you start updating them together in a way that just doesn't work out, then you want to consider using useReducer. Now, to still give you a couple of ideas when to use useState versus useReducer, useState is your main state management tool. Typically, you start with useState, and often it's all you need. It's great for independent pieces of state and data. It's great for simple state, you could say. It's great if state updates are easy and limited to a few kinds of updates. So if you don't have a lot of different cases that will change a state, and especially if you don't have, let's say, an object as a state or anything like that. Now, if you do have an object as a state or a more complex state, useReducer might be interesting because in general, useReducer is great if you need more power. And with more power, I simply mean that you can write such a reducer function that can contain more complex state updating logic, where you always are guaranteed to work with the latest state snapshot, and where you can move that potentially more complex logic out of your component function body into a separate reducer function. So also to restructure code, that might be interesting. You should especially consider useReducer if you're dealing with related data with state that is made up of related pieces of state. So when you, for example, have a scenario as we had it with our form input state. And in general, useReducer can be helpful if you have more complex state updates, if you have different cases, different actions that can change a state, cases like this. Now, there is no hard rule, and there, as always in programming, is no clear wrong or right. You can certainly also handle cases where useReducer would be good with just useState, especially when combining that with useEffect. But sometimes using useReducer just might be more elegant or simpler. On the other hand, you should absolutely not always use useReducer, because often that will be overkill. If you have just a simple state that just switches between two different values, for example, using useReducer might be overkill. And that's it for useReducer. Now, you could absolutely also use useReducer to manage the form state as a whole with useReducer instead of using useState for the form validity. You could replace these two reducers and the form validity with one big reducer that manages the entire form, but that's something I will come back to later in the forms module, since for now, it's just important that you understand useReducer and when to use it.